Hello everybody, I'm Happy Face, and welcome to my Lies of P boss ranking. Now, I absolutely love this game. It's probably in my top 5 favorite games of all time, so I thought why not boss ranking since it had been over a year since I had last played it. On my first playthrough over a year ago, I used the first half-decent weapon that I had found, and that was kind of it. It made the game very difficult since it was a pretty trash weapon, but I had a fun time since I really got to know the moveset. Then I decided I was going to replay it again for this video, and I decided to pick a little bit of a better weapon. After a lot of the game, I looked through all the weapons, figured out which one would be my favorite, and used that one. This is the footage you're seeing now, and unfortunately my footage corrupted for one of the boss fights about halfway through the game, and since I didn't want to leave it out since it's kind of an important fight, I decided to go back through New Game Plus. These are the 2.5-ish playthroughs that I've done, and I will be taking all of them into account for this ranking, so if something seems like it was really easy on the footage that you're watching, doesn't mean it was super easy for me on my first playthrough. Now, this game is kind of split in its bosses. There's bosses and mini-bosses, and the bottom half of the list is mainly mini-bosses since they're a lot less complex than the main bosses, which take up the second half of the list. Which kind of makes sense since the main bosses seem to have more effort put into them and be a lot more of the focus, so I guess that's a good thing that most of them are better. There's 3 types of bosses you'll encounter. The first one is humans. This is the main type of mini-boss, and they're super simple, but they're still kind of fun since they have more humanoid aspects. They're usually really easy to stagger and don't provide much difficulty since they hardly do any damage, but they are very fast. Then there's puppets, which can either be humanoids, which are still very fun, or these big mechanical monstrosities, which I think are the best bosses in the game. Then there's the corpses, which are kind of like the big mechanical monstrosities, except they usually proc debuffs. Speaking of debuffs, over half of the bosses in this game proc debuffs, so it will get a little bit redundant me saying how annoying a boss is because it can proc a debuff if you get hit too many times. That's honestly my biggest complaint with the bosses in this game, is that literally all of the main bosses except 2 proc debuffs. Now, the criteria for this is the same as any of my other boss rankings, so if you watch them, feel free to skip this part. First is arena, which is pretty simple, just where you fight the boss. I think this is very important because if it's too small, too big, or has some hazards in it, it could add or take away a lot from the boss fight. Second is balance. Difficulty is very important, and something being way too easy or way too hard does not sit well with me. Then is design. This is the most complicated. It's just like how well the fight plays, and it's usually how I try to eliminate bias from these rankings by making it just on how well and good the fight is. For example, I personally don't like the Abyss Watchers from Dark Souls 3, however I think they're a very well-made boss, so they would do well in this category even if they wouldn't do well in the entertainment category, which is my final category and the most important category because I play video games to have fun, and if I'm not having fun playing a video game or fighting a boss, then that is a problem. I will also dock points for criminally horrible runbacks because I personally don't like to waste my time running through a level for the 700th time on a difficult boss. And if there's a tie and I can't come up with which boss is better, then I will sometimes take the music into account, since sometimes the best way to get in the zone is just to turn off the music and lock in. At number 25 is Door Guardian. This is without a doubt in my mind the worst boss in the game, and maybe a contender for one of my least favorite bosses of all time. I think that boss spacing is a problem in this game, considering some areas have like 4 bosses right in a row, and they seem way too close together, and then other areas don't even have bosses. This is one of those bosses that just feels like he's kind of thrown there because they wanted to have an extra boss, which usually isn't a bad thing as someone who loves bosses, but this one just doesn't pull it off. He's kind of like the Tower Knight from Demon's Souls, where you have to hit him in the leg so he falls down and you can do big damage to his head. The issue being, I had this big heavy weapon, which does tons of stagger damage. The problem is I still had a ton of trouble staggering this guy. The main reason is because you can only hit him on half of his body, and if he turned at any point while I was swinging my weapon, it would miss-hit and not do any damage at all, which was super infuriating considering the fact that it takes all of my stamina. Speaking of taking stamina, he procs the shock debuff, which makes your stamina come back slower, which is even worse for my slow weapon moveset. I also found his attacks to just be not that fun to dodge, and blocking them also seemed to proc shock, which was super annoying since I find blocking to be a lot better than dodging in this game, which I guess you could say is a skill issue for not adapting to that, but I still think you should be able to block most attacks if they're not perilous. Speaking of, his perilous attacks are even worse than most other ones, doing most of my health bar. And it seems like you have a lot of downtime to recover here, but it seemed like I had to actually make good windows to heal and couldn't just do it willy-nilly despite this guy being a hulking brute. So this is definitely my least favorite boss in the game, and there's no question about it, but that means we can only go up from here. At number 24 is Robber Weasel. Now, this is our first of the many humanoid stalker bosses of this game, and most of them are alright, but this is definitely my least favorite. He doesn't really proc any annoying debuffs, his moveset's actually not even that annoying, he's placed in an actually half-decent spot. My issue is his ranged attacks are the most infuriating thing ever. I don't think I got angrier at another boss in this game. I died to him maybe once, but probably not, And in both of my playthroughs, I just found these range attacks followed up by a perilous charge to be the most infuriating thing in the entire game. And because of that, this left a horrible taste in my mouth, and I put Robert Weasel this low. And number 23 is the Atoned. This is the first boss that required a New Game Plus playthrough, but not because of a recording mishap, but because I made the wrong choice. This is one of the bosses that if you tell the truth, you'll fight it, and if you lie, they'll ignore you. And because of that, I had to come back and make the correct choice to get the boss fight, which was kind of annoying, but I wasn't really going to come back and do it until I messed another boss later, and then that made me have to do a New Game Plus playthrough. Now, this fight is interesting and incredibly easy, since the only hard part is that they proc decay, but once I got in the zone and started dodging like 1 or 2 attacks, I understood the pattern and just crushed her with charged R2s. Decay is probably my least favorite debuff in the game, since it doesn't instantly end your run, but it causes your weapon durability to slowly decay, which is super annoying, especially when I had this big heavy weapon, which takes up a lot of durability to do charge attacks. Number 22 is Owl Doctor. Are these mini-bosses starting to get a little bit redundant yet? Because guess what? We have a lot more to go. Now, Owl Doctor is a little bit annoying because of his arena. He can easily pin you in a corner of his little wooden shack. But the main annoying part is where I come up with the term, where is it my turn? Some of these bosses attack you so fast with small weapons that it's almost never your turn to get an attack in, and this makes it even worse with my big heavy weapons. Eventually I did find out that just backing away from them and charging up an R2 while they lore walk toward you is the easiest way to hit them, but until I found that out, these bosses actually ended up being a little bit difficult. And yes, we will see a lot more of them. At number 21, we have The Survivor. Now, this is the first of the When Is It My Turn bosses, being fought all the way back in Divinity Works, which is like the 3rd area in the game. I do find this boss to be very interesting, but I swear I could not get an attack off anywhere in this fight. I had to wait until I broke his weapon before I finally found a solid opening to hit him. I think this is sometimes fine because it teaches you how to deflect and block a lot better, but I still think they could have toned it down a little bit and maybe given you a few chances to hit him. At number 20 is the Black Cat. I'll get the positive out of the way first. This guy is an NPC throughout most of the game, and so fighting him as a boss is very interesting, and I guess there's 2 positives. He's a little bit later in the game, so he takes maybe like 5 or 6 charged R2s instead of 3 or 4. Otherwise, he's still pretty simple and a lot like a lot of the other Stalker bosses, but I do find these things to put him above the others. Also, just placement is a lot more of a climactic position, and I think that adds to his character a lot. At number 19, we have the Red Fox. Now, again, this is another one of those NPCs throughout the main game that turns into a boss near the end, and I do find this one to be better than Black Cat for a few reasons. One, I think the moveset's more interesting being a sword instead of a spear, and number 2, you fight her on a staircase, which gives you more potential to be cheesed and also to cheese her. I find this fight to just be one of the better of the Stalker fights, which isn't saying a lot, but hey, at least we're getting out of the bottom of the barrel Stalkers. And number 18 is Mad Donkey. It's funny that the first Stalker ends up being one of the best. I guess at this point you weren't desensitized to Stalkers yet, so it was kind of an interesting boss. And it's the first non-tutorial boss, so I guess that's something else too. He's fought on a bridge, which is an awesome setting, and he has a big heavy weapon rather than a small fast one, which is something no other Stalkers have and makes him very interesting. He's not quite my favorite of the Stalkers, but we'll get to that later. And number 17 is Walker of Illusions. This fight, while not technically being a Stalker, fights very much like one, considering the fact that it's just a person with a sword. Now, interestingly, she can split into a clone halfway through the fight, and that's about the only thing she has going for her that's different from the other bosses. Thankfully, I had just gotten my weapon right before this boss and ended up pancaking her into oblivion. Now, the fact that she has more attacks and a lot of perilous attacks is very interesting, and she still has that fast feel of a Stalker, but without being as boring and mundane as they are. So I think that's definitely good, but considering her fight is still pretty stale, especially considering this is in the second half of the game when you've already fought a bajillion Stalkers, I definitely think it belongs here. At number 16 is the Mad Clown Puppet. Now, if you had asked me after just my first playthrough what I thought the worst boss in Lies of P was, not only would this have been worse than Door Guardian, but I would have complained about it for literal hours and said it's probably one of the worst bosses ever made. I don't necessarily think that now, considering it's not as nearly bland as some of the Stalkers, but I definitely don't think it's still amazing yet. Its arena is very annoying considering you're on a bridge full of enemies. Now, I did learn that you can run it past the enemies in my New Game Plus playthrough, but still, that's not a very intuitive thing to do, especially since it starts walking towards you after a little while. One of the big positives I can say is that his one perilous attack is different depending on what range you are from him. If you're really close, he'll do a combo attack, and if you're really far away, he'll do a range attack. I think that's a really interesting concept that not really any other bosses do, and you can only tell which attack he's going to do by the distance you are. There's no other way to tell. The only reason I still consider calling this boss bad is his charge attack, where he rears back and then lunges at you with his belly. I find this not only be annoying, but also kind of poorly telegraphed, especially considering how fast it comes out, and it's definitely one of the most annoying attacks to block. Overall, I hate clowns, and this boss is a little bit better than I originally thought, but it's still definitely not one of my favorites in this game. Number 15 is the Puppet of the Future. To my knowledge, this is the only boss that shows up in multiple places with a health bar, because some bosses, they'll show up later in the game, but they're just basic enemies by that point. I think that's really cool that they've reused this boss, especially considering he's one of the more fun ones, especially of the mini-bosses. Now, he has only a few attacks, I think like 4 or something. The first one is a stomp. It's pretty simple to dodge, you just have to back up. The second one is a slam, which is also, you just have to get out of the way. The third one is a double stomp, where you just have to run away from him. And the third one, he puts both of the balls down and starts swinging around. This I find to be the most interesting, because you can either stay in close with a little bit of risk to get in high damage, or back up if you want to heal. Now, I find this to be really annoying that he procs Shock, and also that you fight the first one in a poison swamp, but I still think it's a very interesting fight, especially because you can drain the poison if you explore the level enough. I find them to be very basic boss fights, and that's, I think, why it's good they're repeated. I think it's good that something like that is repeated throughout the game, and something that you can kind of look forward to as you're going along. At number 14 is Corrupted Parade Master. It took 11 slots, but we finally made it. The first real boss in Lies of P. Now, why is this my least favorite? Well, first, he procs Decay, which already loses some points because I hate that debuff so much. Second, he's a reskin of the first boss with a debuff, which is, I think, super annoying, especially considering the first boss was okay at best. And worst of all is they hype him up so poorly. There's this whole attack at the hotel, and then you have to, you can't warp, and you have to come here by on foot like you did at the beginning of the game. And then Gemini says, oh, this is worse than what we saw at the cathedral, which we'll see what that boss is way later in the top 5. And let me just tell you, that is an absolute way worse monstrosity than this thing. So not only is he poorly overhyped, but he's also at one of the most intense parts of the game, and then it's met with this, a reskin of the first boss? Really? You couldn't have made something new for this part? That's why I think this is the worst main boss in the game, but I still don't think it's that bad, especially compared to the mini-bosses, because there's only one mini-boss that makes it better than this. At number 13, we have Champion Victor. Now, I don't know what the general consensus on this boss is, but I assume he's pretty well liked. I personally, though, don't like this boss nearly as much as I thought I would, considering on my first playthrough I really wanted to like him, but I just didn't. And then on my second playthrough I came back and I also, again, wanted to like him, but I just didn't. I think as a character he's hilarious and one of the most funny in the entire game, but I think as a boss he doesn't pull it off that well. And if it couldn't be worse, this is the entire reason I had to do a New Game Plus playthrough, because literally right before I entered the fog gate, the footage corrupted and I lost it for this fight, which sucks, but I guess that happens sometimes. Now, on my New Game Plus playthrough, he was even worse, considering most of his attacks were near one-shots, and I actually had to fight him for an elongated period of time. This made me not like the boss very much, but I can't really dock him for that, because that's in New Game Plus, not regular New Game, so I shouldn't really be judging off that, but it still left a bad taste in my mouth. My biggest issue with this fight, though, is his taunt, grab, and uppercut, because their startup animations look very similar, and so I'd think it was the taunt and swing, and then end up getting grabbed, or I would think it's the grab, so I back up and then end up missing a free swing. This really annoyed me, especially considering this fight also has the really annoying thing of every single combo having one extra right jab at the end of it, which was just not really interesting, and I felt like it just made every single combo last longer just for the sake of lasting longer. And the worst part, by far, was his charge attack. If you blocked it, you'd get staggered and guaranteed hit afterwards. And if you dodged it, then in the second phase, he would just queue up another one until it hit you. It felt like the bald bull charging from Punch-Out, but it was even worse because instead of being able to counter it, I just had to die pretty much every time or get lucky and block the attack afterwards because he took too long to wind it up. This was super annoying, and it definitely made me not like this fight as much as I wanted to, but I still think as a character, Champion Victor is one of the best, and as a fight, I still think I can understand why people enjoy it. I just personally don't like it as much. But we're definitely getting on to the better bosses, and even though I had a lot of negative things to say about this, I still think Victor was a very positive experience, and I would say that the game would be worse without him in it, which is not nearly as much as I could say for some of the bosses before it, which just felt like filler content. 12 is the Black Rabbit Brotherhood's second fight. Like I said in the last segment, I don't know what the general consensus on bosses are in this game, but I assume this one's pretty hated. If my take on Victor was more negative than average, I'm guessing my take on this boss is going to be more positive than average. I actually find this to be a pretty interesting and well-designed fight. I think that one brother attacking you at a time being telegraphed by which one has their weapon buffed is very interesting. Also, the fact that they have all different debuffs and moveset is very well done. My two critiques are that they've used range attacks while you're fighting them, which kind of breaks up the fight a little bit, but I think this makes sense considering if they weren't doing that, then what would the point of fighting them not one at a time be? My other issue is that once you kill the second to last brother and it's just the last one, the coffin opens, releasing the eldest, which one I think is annoying because we already fought this guy, and two makes it so you have to fight two things at once in this kind of meh arena. So those are my two issues. Otherwise, I think it's actually really cool. The movesets are fun to deal with, and my strategy of saving the littlest brother to last so I can pancake them into oblivion before the eldest can get out was a very good strategy. Now, fighting the eldest with all of his new attacks is pretty interesting, and I didn't actually hate this boss. I thought it was pretty solid. Definitely not as good as the first fight, but still a solid fight in general, and I definitely enjoyed it more than I thought I would. At number 11 is the Parade Master. Yeah, that's right, the really basic first boss made it almost into the top 10. Now, I think the reason this happened is one, because of all the basic stalker fights, and two, because it's actually a pretty solid first boss. Is it super easy on a repeat playthrough or New Game Plus? Yes. But is it still a fun, solid early game challenge for people who haven't played the game before? Yes. I think it does well at teaching you how to dodge bosses and what bosses are going to be like in this game. So for that, I think it's a solid fight. I don't know much else to say here, considering it's a very basic fight, but still, overall, very good first boss, and not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. At number 10, we have the White Lady. Now, I know what you're thinking. I thought you hated these bosses, but that's not necessarily true. I just think they're a little bit overdone, all being random dudes in animal masks. But this one, first of all, is not wearing an animal mask. Second, I really like her spectacle and her placement. She's placed in the middle of Rosa Isabelle Street, which is one of the most painful areas in the entire game. And she's placed in kind of this like outside theater area, which is awesome. She's also one of the few bosses that talks to you a lot, which I think is very interesting, making her more like an NPC than an enemy. I also find her attacks to just be the most fun. The spin to win rapier attack is obviously my favorite, where she just does a little twirl and then pokes you. I think it's one of the most funny attacks, and it definitely shows that it fits in Rosa Isabelle Street, considering it's being the entertainment district and she's using dance moves to attack you. What if I said that I hadn't even mentioned the best part of this fight yet? By far my favorite part of this fight, and the thing that makes it one of my favorites in the whole game, is the music. The atmosphere that this music brings to the fight is so amazing, and it's what makes it such a good fight. Not only before, but also during the fight is just awesome. Also, her perilous attacks are fun and functional, and she has that quick stalker moveset while not being too annoying and spammy like a lot of the other ones. Now, all of this makes White Lady an absolutely amazing boss, definitely deserving of a spot in the top 10. At number 9 is the eldest of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood, aka the first fight. What makes me like this fight so much more is that the older brother is like the main target, and the other brothers are more of like ads than actual bosses. I think this is a lot more interesting because it gives you one target to focus on, and it lets you DPS the older brother down before the other brothers spawn, making it have kind of a challenge where you can do this or that, and I think it's a very fun idea. Now, the concept of fighting the older brother is really cool, but having the other ones jump down and then he take a more passive backseat role while only charging at you from a distance, I think is very interesting. I also like that it's telegraphed by a sound effect, so you can just know exactly what you're doing the first time it comes out. This is really good and makes the fight seem very fair, even though it's 2v1 for most of the fight. I also just find the eldest brother's moveset to be the most interesting rather than all the others, so it's good that you have the main focus on him. I like the voice lines and mockery during this fight, which adds a lot, especially considering they're recurring characters throughout the game, so it's kind of important that you get to see the human side of them and that you get more dialogue than just static or nothing. At number 8 is Green Monster of the Swamp. Now, unfortunately for this boss, he comes after what is probably my least favorite area in the game, so I was already kind of annoyed fighting this guy, but I guess that's alright, considering he introduces a really cool mechanic of only proccing decay with a certain part of his body. The horns on his head are the only things that you can use to proc decay, which is really cool and comes back in a boss I like a lot later down the road. Now, in the first phase, most of his attacks are pretty simple, what you'd expect, like slashes and pokes from those things, but the second phase is where I really start to get annoyed. He inhabits the Scrapped Watchman, which is an early game boss that I actually really enjoy. The problem being, one, it's reused, which, like we discussed with Corrupted Parade Master, is incredibly lazy, and two, it still procs decay, which makes it annoying and makes it just like the Scrapped Watchman, except he procs a different debuff. Now, the new attacks that he has in that phase are a big jump, which is kind of interesting, and it can break up the flow of combat, which is cool, but sometimes I find blocking it to be super annoying. And the other one is like this big crazy combo, which insta-procs decay if you don't block all of it, which is interesting, and again, makes very good gameplay requirements, but I think it's actually a more fun attack attack than you would think because you can just kind of spam the block button and it's super satisfying to parry. So overall, I like this boss, but again, it just feels kind of lazy that they couldn't make a second phase for it, but overall, it's still a pretty solid fight. At number 7, we have Simon Manus. Manus is interesting because he's kind of like an evil NPC throughout most of the game, so it's kind of obvious that you're going to fight him later, but when you get to his arena, you don't expect the amalgamated monstrosity that you see. I think it's a really cool boss fight, but I just found a few problems. One, he procs Disruption, also known as this game's insta-kill debuff, which is not really difficult to dodge the attacks, but if you don't know what you're doing, it can be so annoying, especially because insta-kill attacks are just the worst. Now, my main problem, though, was that I actually found it to be too easy. This is the final boss in the game if you don't make a certain decision at the end, and it was kind of disappointing. Not for spectacle, it was actually very interesting, but for difficulty. I found myself just kind of smacking him around and dying. I could just heal through everything, and it just wasn't that hard. His attacks had no substance to them, and I kind of just had to block willy-nilly, and it was done. I still really liked this fight, and I found it to be very fun, but it just felt too easy. On my first playthrough, I remember being really difficult, but on this playthrough, I found it to be, like, so easy. Like, easier than Scrapped Watchman and Monster of the Swamp, which were pretty easy bosses. So because of all of this, I think that this boss definitely deserves to be high up, but not quite top 5. Second phase is awesome, though. The fact that he, like, pulls out this whole godly thing, and he has these hands coming down from the ceiling, and the arena, oh my gosh, the arena is beautiful. So because of all of that, I had to put Simon Manus pretty high, but I just, like, something, I don't know what it was, but something felt off. At number 6 is Nameless Puppet. If you had asked me after my first playthrough what my favorite boss was, this probably would have taken the top spot. Even now, it still stood up very well. The problem is, just like Manus, it was kind of too easy. I was just kind of blocking, swinging, healing, and didn't really care. It just felt too easy. I don't know if I was playing really well that day or what, but these last 2 bosses were just lacking some difficulty. Does that mean I don't like Nameless Puppet? Absolutely not. This is one of the most fun bosses in the entire game. I think his second phase especially is one of the best phases of a boss ever. His double sword moveset feels so fun to dodge and never unfair at all, even with being really fast. It reminds me of like Lady Maria from Bloodborne, which is a huge compliment because I absolutely love that boss. And this was just an absolutely awesome cinematic spectacle. I also like that you have to make a choice, but it almost feels like the correct choice. It feels like the game wanted you to fight this boss, even if unintentionally. My other issue is I feel like he's a little bit bland for a final boss. He's just a puppet with swords, which again, not a problem at all. I absolutely love that fight, but it feels like they should have had something like the King of Puppets be the final fight. I do like that he's being controlled by Geppetto, but I almost would have preferred to fight Geppetto rather than the puppet. It feels like it's just a cover-up for what I actually should be fighting in this final boss. It kind of hurts me to not put Nameless Puppet in the top 5, but I still think this is the right place for him considering what we have left. And considering how positive I am about this, I couldn't be more positive considering we have 5 bosses that are better than this. At number 5 is King's Flame Falco. Now, I'm guessing some people are going to call me absolutely delusional for not only putting this above Simon Manus and Nameless Puppet, but also for putting it in the top 5. I just personally think it's a really fun early game boss that pulls off this mechanical robot design really well. My only critique is in the second phase. His first attack, where he covers the ground in fire, seems to be really difficult to dodge. I've actually never been able to do it, and it also seems to instant proc overheat. I don't know if it's trying to teach you a mechanic I didn't understand, but I still think it's a fine attack as long as you have enough heals to get rid of it. Now, his perilous attacks are super fun to dodge, and his flame attacks in the second phase, other than that one, still seem super fair, and really nothing in this fight makes it feel unfair. He has a big, heavy fist weapon, which is just interesting because it's really something you haven't seen yet before. It takes a lot of health away when you block it, but it's pretty easy to get it back since he's such a slow-moving boss. I find this to be one of the definitely most interesting bosses in this game, and it just feels really well placed at the end of Vanini works, so I definitely think this belongs in the top 5. At number 4 is the Scrapped Watchman. I actually really like Scrapped Watchman. I know you could say that he's too easy because he's placed so early in the game, but on my New Game Plus playthrough, I actually struggled with him a little bit. He's the first real boss you'll encounter since Parade Master's a tutorial boss and Mad Donkey's a mini-boss, so this is your first real taste of what bosses in Lies of P are going to be like. I actually really like this, and I find this to be one of the most interesting fights in the entire game. I find him proccing Electric Shock at this point in the game to be a little bit weird, considering it's like I said earlier, the first real boss, and you're already proccing debuffs. But other than that, I still think it's a really awesome fight. The electric shock is pretty easy to dodge, and the only thing I have a minor complaint about is when he puts it all over the floor and you have to get out of one place. This kind of breaks up the flow of the fight, but I still think it's fine, and he pulls it off well without making it seem too unfair, so I think it's cool. His attack where he swings both of his arms and then does a perilous attack afterwards is so interesting, and it's probably one of my favorite attacks in the entirety of this game. If I had to find something to get mad at him about, it would be the attack where he rears his arm back and then delays it for a long time before slashing you. I find this attack to be a little bit inconsistent to dodge, but after a little bit it didn't end up being too bad, and I found it to just be really fair even despite it hitting me all the time. I always felt like it was my fault and not some garbage. I felt like I was the one messing up and not the game messing me up. I also find that when you come back in New Game Plus and you can hear the voice lines instead of just puppet static to be really interesting, and I find it to be one of the coolest on this fight. All of these things make me think Scrapped Watchman definitely deserves a spot in the top 5, even if he might be an easy early game boss. At number 3 is Laxasia the Complete. Now, the one thing I do know about Lies of P is that this is the fan favorite boss, so I think I'm going to get a little bit of hate for putting it at number 3. But I think that there are 2 bosses in this game which are just better. I don't really have any problems with Laxasia, except maybe a really one small problem. I think the fact that you can break her shield in the first phase, which will then help you in the second phase, is a really interesting gimmick that no other boss goes into. I find her attacks to be very fair and interesting to dodge, especially in the first phase. My one issue comes with the fact that she procs Electric Shock. Now, unlike Scrapped Watchman, where this isn't really a problem, I did learn that this drains your Fable charges. The issue is, she has this attack in the second phase where she goes into the sky, shoots some lightning balls at you, and then charges down at you. I could not find a way to dodge or parry this, so the only way I found was using a Fable Art blocking attack. The issue is, because Electric Shock drains this, if you get Electric Shock procced on you, it's basically over if she does this attacks, and she'll just lose half your health bar. This is also the only time I could find with my big heavy weapons to get attacks in, since she was very fast and agile. I think this is awesome, and I find that to be very interesting. You can't just spam attacks. You have to be very deliberate with when you hit and why you hit. I find that to be very fun, but I just find the fact that this attack not being able to be dodged or blocked, and you have to use a specific resource that she can drain, to be a little bit annoying. Otherwise, I could not praise this boss more heavily. I think my only issues are that it's placed in the second half of the game, which I feel is a little bit less interesting than the first half, and I also feel that her arena is lacking a little bit of substance, just being a bridge. But it's still an awesome spectacle, and definitely the best fight in the second half of the game. Laxasia is also by far the most difficult boss in the game, which makes sense considering she's the sword of Simon Manus, who's like the most powerful dude in the game, and also like the main villain. But still, I find that to be really good that they managed to balance that enough that I still had a fun time fighting this boss, despite her being one of the hardest in the entire game. Number 2 is Fallen Archbishop Andreas. This was the moment that I fell in love with Lies of P on my first playthrough, so I had to put this guy really high up on the list. I only have one complaint, and that's in the second phase when he has the angel on one side and the first phase of the fight on the other side of his body. You can just run around to the other side of his body and basically fight the first phase twice. I think this is cool that they kind of give you an option on which side you want to fight, because if you were comfortable with the first phase, you can fight the first phase again. But I find it to be a little cheesy, because I do think the first phase is far easier. My other minor complaint is when he has this big explosion attack in the second phase. I feel like it does way too much damage, and I couldn't figure out how to dodge it, but again, this is probably a skill issue, like a lot of the other things in this game. Otherwise, I couldn't praise this boss more heavily. The parts of him that proc decay are his tongue, which is interesting because just like Green Monster of the Swamp, it's only one part of his body that procs it rather than being every single attack, which is really good, so then you know exactly what to look out for and what to dodge when you don't want to get decay procced on you. This is really good design, and I think it absolutely adds a lot to this boss. His attacks are also just fun to dodge, and all of them feel fair. Even the perilous ones where he gets up on his legs and sits down, it just feels fair. None of it feels unfun. I would say, again, the only issue is that you don't have to fight the angel part in the second phase. Other than that, this is a near perfect fight, and I have literally no other complaints about it. The only reason I couldn't put this boss at number 1 is because the boss at number 1 has literally no issues with it. At number 1 is Romeo, King of Puppets. There was no question about it. From the instant that I saw this boss, I knew it was going to be number 1. The first phase is alright. It's still pretty good and very difficult. On my first playthrough, I thought that was the end of the fight, and then when I saw there was a second phase, I almost cried because it took me like 5 tries to get past it. This is definitely the peak difficulty in the first half of the game and is just such an amazing spectacle. You're fighting the King of Puppets. I actually thought this was the final boss in my first playthrough just because of how epic it was. Then in the second phase, when Romeo comes out, it's just absolutely perfect. You're fighting a humanoid, but he's really fast, and just, I mean, the only reason I struggled with this fight was pure skill issue. The grab would just get me every single time. I could see why people would say the attack where he buffs his weapon with fire is unfair, but I think that you just have to run away for it and know that it's coming. Yeah, it'll kill you the first time, but once you know what's going to happen, it really is not too bad. And it just feels like a very fair and balanced boss fight, and also definitely the most fun in the game. Before we get into my final praise for this boss, I just want to give a quick spoiler alert, because I do spoil the ending of the game here. And the absolute best part of this fight, by far, without a doubt, was in my New Game Plus playthrough, when you can hear the puppets' voices, and you could hear his voice, and he's warning you the whole time about Geppetto being evil, which of course comes true at the end of the game, but this guy at the beginning was trying to warn you. This is still the first half of the game, and he's trying to tell you, like, don't trust Geppetto, blah, 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 whatever, right? And it's just so interesting when you go back and you know already what's going to happen, and you basically learn this, and you learn that the only reason he fought you is because he wanted to protect you and make sure that you didn't cause a huge problem by siding with Geppetto. I think this is so cool and just makes this fight even better in my eyes, and definitely makes it the #1 boss in Lies of P without a doubt in my mind. And with all of the amazing Lies of P bosses ranked, thank you everybody so much for watching. I hope this video provided you some entertainment, and I will see you guys next time. Later.